Hello my viewers and welcome back to my channel. Subscribe, like, and don't forget to be part of this conversation by sharing your comments in the comment section down below. I welcome you to a conversation that's long overdue. Now, for too long, a painful chapter in our history has been hidden in the shadows: the Arab slave trade. A dark legacy that spanned over 1,300 years has been veiled in silence. Now, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, subjected to inhumane conditions, and exploited in the service industry as soldiers, domestics, concubines, and dogs. Now, the scars of this trauma still linger even today, yet it remains a topic rarely discussed. You would wonder why. But in this video, different people expose the Arab slave trade. Today, we gather to shed a light on this forgotten history, so we will hear from different people who expose this dark and hidden history and explore the trans-Saharan trade, the Indian Ocean trade, and the Red Sea trade, the lesser known but equally devastating slave trades that ravaged our continent. So with that said, stay tuned as we uncover the truth, confront the pain, and honor the resilience of our ancestors. With that said, check out these interesting videos. I will be right back, and when I do, I share more on this.
Did you know that the longest trade in enslaved Africans did not happen at the hands of the Europeans, but instead in the hands of the Arabs? I'm talking about a slave trade that took place around the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, one that started way back in the 7th century in the hands of so-called Muslims. You see, many of us know very well about the transatlantic slave trade, about Europeans pulling enslaved Africans from their homelands and trafficking them across the Atlantic Ocean to be taken to North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. I myself am a product of that trade, and it's been comprehensively researched. We know that it started in about the 15th century. We know that it involved about 12 million enslaved Africans being torn from their homes and taken to some of the worst conditions that humanity has ever seen. The transatlantic slave trade was the foundation for Western industrialism and capitalism in the way that our world works today. You know, these enslaved people were forced to work on huge plantations and produce agricultural that ended up driving and running the economy that we now see throughout the Western world. Because this work was so labor intensive, the transatlantic slave trade really wanted men. So for every 2 men, there were only 1 female that was taken to work on these plantations because, of course, they could work harder and longer on average. And while the European states proclaimed an allegiance to Christianity, they were more so dealing in power rather than religion, and that's what legitimized them. And then, of course, they went back to find things and invent things within their religious texts that helped them to see the enslavement of other human beings as okay. Now, let's contrast that with what I'm going to call the Indian Ocean slave trade, aka the Arab slave trade. So this started in about the 7th century, and it involved trafficking about 10 to 20 million enslaved Africans. But instead of taking them mostly from West Africa, most of these people were taken from the eastern coast and interior of Africa, as you can see on the map behind me. And instead of going to places like Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, etc., Louisiana, they're going to places like China, India, Sri Lanka, Yemen, Oman, etc. And instead of their slavers being European, they were Arab. And another interesting difference between the two slave trades is that for the most part, the enslaved people in the Indian Ocean trade weren't working on huge plantations. Instead, they were in the service industry, working as soldiers, as domestics, and most notoriously as concubines. And yes, the Arabs were trading and have traded thousands of young African men. The Arab world did not officially abolish slavery until well into the 20th century. And many of them still have the nerve to call Black people, fellow Muslims, abid, which means slave.
So the Arab slave trade was actually a lot worse than the Atlantic slave trade. So the Arab slave trade lasted about 13 centuries, and they took more slaves out of Africa than European slavers. The Arab slavers were Africans in transit in the Sahara Desert than Europeans and Americans combined. And Arab slavers didn't discriminate when it came to enslaving people. They enslaved whites, Asians, light and dark-skinned Africans. They didn't care. And these slaves that made the trek across the Saharan Desert were often chained together and whipped indiscriminately. People that weren't able to keep up with the caravan were left behind to die from thirst or starvation. And fun fact, there's actually been a lot of bodies found across these old Saharan slave routes. This is a very short history of the cruel realities of the Arab slave trade.
The Arabic slave trade. 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade, Arabs, so-called Muslims, sold African people from mostly East Africa in slave markets to India and as far away as China. The conditions were brutal and many Africans died. Zanzibar slave trade, Google that. When I was a kid, there were some Greek racists who called me Zinji. Zinji is a word from that ancient Arabic black slave trade. You have to understand that these histories are suppressed and silenced, and Pan-African thought is heavily censored in social media. It's only thanks to TikTok these stories are coming forward. So our people don't know about these histories.
The Arab-Muslim slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade, lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade. It operated for more than 1,300 years, taking millions of Africans away from the continent to work in foreign lands under the most inhumane conditions. Unfortunately, because it has not been as closely studied as the transatlantic slave trade, the exact number of people captured from Africa in the Trans-Saharan slave trade is yet to be fully ascertained. It is currently estimated at about 9 million souls.
So where did the 17 million slaves the Arabs had go? The 12 million the Europeans took we see every day, but where are the ones the Arabs took? Great question, but the dilemma is even worse than that, for some non-Western sources actually say between 28 and 112 million Africans were trafficked during the 1400 years of the Arab slave trade, the latter figure coming from Ghanaian professor John Azumah. So the question stands, where are all of them? This contemporary account from German explorer Gustav Nachtigall, writing about the 3-month-long journey through the Sahara Desert, gives us our first clue. The poor children of the Black Country seem to meet their death here. Their endless journey under the blows, hunger and thirst of deadly exhaustion have paralyzed their last faculties of resistance. If the poor creatures lack strength to get up and walk again, they are simply abandoned, and their minds slowly fade under the destructive effect of the rays of the sun, hunger and thirst. The estimates of the mortality rate of this journey range wildly, but around 20 to 50% of them perhaps met their end here, but the horror was only just beginning. After surviving that journey, the men were systematically treated to stop them from reproducing. This appalling practice of mutilation had obscenely high death rate, with conservative estimates saying 6 out of 10 slaves died from their wounds. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, perhaps 2/3 were women who were sold into slavery. They obviously couldn't be treated, but the women born by them were either forcefully aborted or killed at birth. There are some accounts of these children surviving into adulthood, however they're rare, and even if they did survive, they had great trouble being accepted into society, for they were thought to be the descendants of Ham through the curse of Noah. Because of the lack of concrete sources, it's impossible to really know the numbers, but what we do know is this: the mortality rate of slaves going to the Americas was about 10%, which is appalling. However, the percentage of slaves dying en route to the Arab slave markets was about 80 or 90%.
Arab Islamic slave trade of East Africans. Over at least 100 million people were enslaved. That was before the transatlantic.
Hundreds of years before. That's why you have Zanzibar, bro. You know, a lot of people that live in Zanzibar, they're the descendants of slaves.
Okay.
But they call themselves Swahili because freeborns at that time were Swahili. So Swahili became a euphemism for ex-slave.
I did not know that.
At least 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade.
Wow.
Yeah. And in that slave trade, they took majority women, African women and girls. So it wasn't just human king, it was as well.
Wow.
And they don't talk about it. It's on the hash. If you
Yeah.
know, you know. If you don't know, you see that channel is still open because there's issues. They're taking so-called domestic workers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because I know Kenya had an issue. There was a lady who was fighting for women in Kenya. There's also issues from the Ugandan route. There's also still issues from Nigeria. And what is going on?
Some countries, I'm pretty sure, have banned domestic workers from going to Qatar and them places because people are getting their organs harvested.
Yes, there's that as well.
Yeah, people come back with no kidneys. It's crazy.
You see? So there's a lot of history for us to read. What are we doing? What are we?
Right,
We
why
can't
not?
just be reading English Muzungu books here. We have to pick our
It's
own.
true. Because I could tell you about Henry VIII. I could tell you about his wives,
look at you,
everything.
wow.
But if you told
You
me...
even know his wives.
I know his wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, all of that nonsense. But if you told me now, tell me about your history. You got, I'd be like, I know the king. But that's about...
We're not going to do this. We're not going to do whataboutism for enslavement. Yes, Arabs had a huge trade of human beings, but so did ancient Romans. They're both bad. But by saying, hey, Arabs did it first, it does not make the enslavement of human beings for the production of sugar and all okay. Just doesn't. But listen, if you really want whataboutism, the tenor of enslavement in the Caribbean was extraordinary. The Arab Muslim world absolutely enslaved humans, and probably for thousands of years. But the European practice set up full-on plantations. We do not see plantations in that same way in the Arab world. They are two different, incredibly inhumane systems. And other than proving that you know something, it doesn't actually make any matter about enslavement in North America. Actually, enslaving a human being is bad. Doesn't matter how you do it, doesn't matter when you do it. But pointing out that another system of enslavement existed did not make this one okay.
Let's talk about the East African slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan or Arab Muslim slave trade. Everyone talks about the slave trade as if it only happened in West Africa. And this is not true. This is not true due to Ethiopian studies from Addis Ababa University explains. The internal Ethiopian slave trade connected the political center of Ethiopia with its peripheries, and the trade in slaves connected Ethiopia with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean world as well as with the Ottoman world. Various policies in the Horn of Africa were dependent on and were commercial centers for slave labor. The regional contours of slavery are relatively well established. Despite the diversity of various forms of human bondage, slavery, and serfdom, as well as the trade in slaves and its relatively rich documentation, slavery has received little attention in the field of Eastern Africa's social, culture, and economic history. Moreover, one feature of Ethiopia is the public silence and the absence of commemorative discourse among the descendants of owner groups, slave descendants, as well as within the public sphere. And this is because East Africa is where the biblical scrolls and biblical people were taken from. If African Americans never looked to East Africa, they would never find its roots.
So thank you to everyone who's engaged on my post about the enslaved fasting during the month of Ramadan. I knew that part of Black American history was something that not a lot of people know, but I didn't realize just how much people did not know. And I knew that taking pride in my faith as a Black person and as a Muslim, that comments like these were coming. I knew that post celebrating my ancestral hold onto the faith of Islam that I still practice to this day was going to cause people to talk about something that has nothing to do with what it is that I was talking about. And I want people to understand that when they say these things about Islam and about Christianity, that the only way that African people or Black people came about those faiths was through forced conversion, that is historically inaccurate. And so because y'all love my dad and I'm trying to get him over here on TikTok, I'm going to have him break it down for you.
Okay, let's give it a try. 3 minutes. There, for the record, there are three kinds of Arabs. There's one, the original Arab. They were commonly what you would call Black. They are the descendants of Noah, the descendants of Ham, the descendants of Cush. They're called Cushites. They lived in the southern area of the peninsula, connected to them and the kingdom of Cush, which extended in through what's commonly known today as Ethiopia. So you had the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula and Ethiopia, where the Cushites reigned. They were the original Arabs. Secondly, there's the people who married into that particular grouping, that particular tribe, etc. They then become Arabs. Third, last but not least, or probably least, are what is now your modern Arab, your modern, what I would refer to as Euro-Arab. All right, because these are the people who, with the advent of Islam, began to come to the peninsula to meet the Prophet, to find out about this Islam, or these are people who resisted the Islam and fought against the Muslims and were conquered, were beaten, but they came out of places like Rome, Byzantium, Persia, Turkey, things like that. So they were eventually subdued. Now keep in mind the places I'm talking about, because I haven't mentioned Africa yet. But I will, because the Muslims go into Africa. They go into Africa, and who do they meet there and engage? Because historians will tell you, some of them will, historians will say they invaded Africa. They didn't invade Africa. What they did was they liberated the black people in Africa from the Europeans who were controlling it. When I say Europeans, I'm talking about your Romans, etc., your Romans and your Byzantines. They controlled Egypt from 100 years after Jesus Christ until they were kicked out by the Muslims in 634. The Muslims who went into there were black. The vast majority of them were what you would call black, and they were black Arabs. They were your Cushites. They moved the Europeans out of Africa. All right? These are the same Arabs, black Arabs, who moved by 711 into Europe and controlled Europe for 800 years. They're commonly referred in history today as the Moors. All right? So there's part of your history. Last but not least, I'm trying to do this in 3 minutes. If someone is telling you that black people, or that black people were forced into Islam, that Africans were forced into Islam, the history is that these Euro Arabs who are ushered into a slave trade that predates European slave trade by almost 600 to 800 years. They passed laws to make sure that Africans, so-called black people, could not convert to Islam. They were in total opposite with the original black Arabs who, during the time of the Prophet, were in control of the Islam. So it went from being pro-black to anti-black by virtue of the same people who had gotten kicked out by these black people, who had been under the heel of black people since the ancient Egyptians, since the ancient Cushites, since Hannibal, since the ancient times. So all they were doing was putting their hatred into their Islam, onto the Islam. Because think about it, you pass a law so that the people could not convert because you want to keep them as slaves. If you convert them by the sword, then they become Muslims, and therefore you can't keep them in slavery, and you have to treat them like your brother. So what would be the purpose of converting them? You would eliminate your slavery. And only people who think as a way of absolving the European conquest of the world and their savagery ask you that question. It's called whataboutism. It's what white people do all the time. When you hear a black person do it, that's just a white thinking black person. That's what blackface was all about. So
now, the Arab slave trade is a painful and often overlooked chapter in human history. For centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and subjected to inhumane conditions, forced labor, and exploitation. The fact that this trade lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade and involved the creation of thousands of young men is a stark reminder of the brutality and cruelty inflicted upon our ancestors. It is important that we acknowledge and confront this dark history rather than hiding it in the shadows. By sharing these stories and experiences, we honor the resilience and strength of those who survived and pay tribute to those who didn't. So let us continue to uncover the truth, learn from our past, and work towards a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. The courage and vulnerability of those sharing the stories and experiences in these videos are a testament to the power of truth-telling and the importance of confronting our collective past. Now, the history of slavery in the Muslim world began with institutions inherited from pre-Islamic Arabia. Now, throughout Muslim history, slaves served in various social and economic roles. From powerful emirs to harshly treated manual laborers, slaves were widely employed in irrigation, mining, and animal husbandry, but most commonly as soldiers, guards, domestic workers, and concubines. Now, the use of slaves for hard physical labor early on in Muslim history led to several destructive slave revolts, the most notable being the Zand Rebellion of 869-883, and led to the end of the practice. Now, many rulers also used slaves in the military and administration to such an extent that slaves could seize power, as did the Mamluks. Now, most slaves were imported from outside the Muslim world. Slavery in Islamic law does not have a racial foundation in principle, although this was not always the case in practice. The Arab slave trade was most active in West Asia, North Africa, Trans-Saharan slave trade, and Southeast Africa, Red Sea slave trade, and Indian Ocean slave trade. And rough estimates place the number of Africans enslaved in the 12th centuries prior to the 20th century at between 6 million to 10 million. Now, the Ottoman slave trade came from raids into Eastern and Central Europe and the Caucasus connected to the Crimean slave trade, while slave traders from the Barbary coast raided the Mediterranean coast of Europe and as far afield as the British Isles and Iceland. In the early 20th century, the authorities in Muslim states gradually outlawed and suppressed slavery, largely due to pressure exerted by Western nations such as Britain and France. Now, slavery in Zanzibar was abolished in 1909 when slave concubines were freed, and the open slave market in Morocco was closed in 1922. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was abolished in 1924 when the new Turkish constitution disbanded the imperial harem and made the last concubines and free citizens of the newly proclaimed republic. Slavery in Iran and slavery in Jordan was abolished in 1929. The Persian Gulf slavery in Bahrain was faced to be abolished in 1937, followed by slavery in Kuwait in 1949 and slavery in Qatar in 1952, while Saudi Arabia and Yemen abolished it in 1962. Now, while Oman followed in 1970, Mauritania became the last state to abolish slavery in 1981. In 1990, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam declared that no one has the right to enslave another human being. Now, as of 2001, however, instances of modern slavery persisted in areas of the Sahel, and several 21st century terroristic jihadist groups have attempted to use historic slavery in the Muslim world as a pretext for reviewing slavery in the 21st century. Now, scholars point to the various difficulties in studying this amorphous phenomenon which occurs over a large geographic region between East Africa and the Near East, a lengthy period of history from the 7th century to the present day, and which only received greater attention after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the terms Arab slave trade and Islamic slave trade and other similar terms are invariably used to refer to this phenomenon. Now, the Arab slave trade is a controversial topic often met with resistance and silence, but discussing this painful history doesn't mean we're trying to justify or downplay the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Rather, people are seeking to educate and acknowledge the lesser-known forms of slavery that have scarred our collective past. The trans-Saharan slave trade, which forcibly enslaved millions of Africans, is a stark reminder of the brutality and cruelty inflicted upon our ancestors. It's important to confront this dark history, not to diminish the suffering of those who endured the transatlantic slave trade, but to understand the scope and complexity of slavery's impact on African lives. For too long, this chapter in history has been overlooked, allowing an incomplete narrative to dominate conversation. By shedding light on the Arab slave trade, we honor the memories of those who suffered and acknowledge the resilience of our ancestors. So let Let us break the silence and work towards a more comprehensive understanding of shared human experience. I don't know what you guys think about these videos, but share your thoughts and contributions as well on what you think about the videos and what was talked about and this topic. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up by tapping on the like button, and thank you for always watching, and see you in my next video as I bring you another interesting video.